Okay, welcome back everyone. Welcome to new BINA year. Okay, so it's Parshas Boy, page 340. So Parshas Boy. Parshas Boy is a action-packed parsha, of course. It's the parsha of Geula, the parsha of redemption. It's when the Yidden are redeemed from Mitzrayim. Also, many mitzvahs. Now starts the process of mitzvahs. Up until Parshas Boy, we have very few mitzvahs in the Torah. From the 630 mitzvahs, we have a few, like having children, like circumcision, the sciatic nerve, not to eat it, and so on. A few, but not a lot. This week's parsha starts with lots of mitzvahs. Number one, the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a nation, which is the mitzvah of the calendar, Rosh Chodesh, the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Many mitzvahs to do with Pesach in general. And then there's also a mitzvah, which I just want to stop for a second and talk about because it's often misunderstood. The mitzvah of Yom Tov and how we know what is permitted and not permitted on a Yom Tov, right? So I'm going to ask you just to look at the middle of the parsha really, which is... I'll show you. If you have a look on page 354. Right. 354, Pasuk 16. And this is the Pasuk where it talks about keeping the first day and the last day of Pesach, which is similar to all other Yom Tovs, right? So it says, "Ubayom harishayin mikra kodesh." On the first day of Pesach, it shall be a holy day. Ubayom hashvi mikra kodesh elachem, and the seventh day as well. Right? Obviously, outside of Israel, it's 2 days and 2 days, but in Israel, it's 1 day and 1 day. The first day and the seventh day. Kol melacha loy ye'aseh bahem. All work shall not be done. With the exception, asher ye'achel lechol nefesh. What must be eaten for every person, in other words, food-related activity, that alone can be done for you, right? So it's interesting like this, just to clarify this, because it comes up a lot in the Torah at various times. So over here, when the Torah introduces Yom Tov, it uses the same expression as Shabbos, which is you shouldn't do melacha, you shouldn't do work. Normally we say, what does work mean? When it comes to Shabbos, work means all 39 prohibited activities of Shabbos, right? And then the Torah gives an exception, however, that which is food-related, directly food-related, like cooking, lighting a fire in order to cook something, carrying food, and so on, that can be done. Okay. Now, this is the only time the Torah does this. In every other Yom Tov, and this comes up later in Chumash, particularly in Parshas Emor, in the middle of Vayikra, where it lists all the Yomim Tovim, right? Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, and so on. It doesn't talk about the exception of food-related activity. However, it uses a different expression than Shabbos. With Shabbos it says, as it does in this pasuk, it says you shouldn't do melacha, blanket statement, shouldn't do melacha. When it comes to Yom Tov, it says you shouldn't do meleches avodah. Work of avodah, of other words, activity that has to work, right? So the Ramban explains the following, says the following, that really what happens is, this pasuk is a fundamental pasuk that gives us the foundation of Yom Tov. In other words, the Torah spells it out. Torah spells it out that the Yom Tov is a day like Shabbos, it's a day you shouldn't do work. However, there's an exception. The exception is food-related activity, right? Once the Torah has given that distinction, then the Torah doesn't outline that distinction anymore with regard to any other Yom Tov. Instead, what it does is, it just changes the language. And in future, it refers to the prohibition of work on Yom Tov as meleches avodah. Shabbos, it's melacha. Yom Tov, it's meleches avodah. Says the Ramban, what does that mean? Because there's two types of melacha, there's two types of work. One is called meleches avodah, and one is called meleches hano. Halacha mean there's work that's activity that's related to work, like harvesting a field, like sewing, like weaving, and so on and so forth, right? That's melechas avoida. That's work-related activity. And then there's activities which is also melacha, but it's more hana based, more personal pleasure, like cooking, lighting a fire to cook, and so on and so forth. That's why the Torah, once it's clarified the distinction here in Parshas Bo, in this week's Parsha, later on it just summarizes it by saying the prohibition of Yontiv is not to do melechas avoida. It's not to do activity that's related to work, like sewing, like plowing, like things like that. But it does not include melechas hana, work to do with pleasure. What is work to do with pleasure? So that's already been explained in this week's Parsha, means food-related work. So that's just how it works. So have you ever seen the Torah, how right?
So the work with pleasure is food.
It's food-related work, and that's permitted on Yontif. No, well, we're not talking about the preparation here. We're talking about the cooking. We're talking about the cooking on Yontif. Yeah. Okay.
Before freezes.
That's right. Before freezes, exactly. It actually used to be easier in those days. Nowadays, everyone drives themselves crazy to make sure everything's ready before Yontif with extras and provisions. Those days, with no freezers, you cooked on Yontif. Whatever you cooked, you cooked. Whatever you didn't cook, you didn't cook. That was the story. Yeah. They used to bake challah on Yontif. All these things, they were all done on Yontif. Even used to shech chickens on Yontif in those days. Yeah, fresh meat. If you want a fresh meat, you have to shech the animal on Yontif, which is all mutter. Obviously, within certain guidelines, and there's certain specifics how you have to do it. But it's interesting when it comes to Yom Kippur, for example. There again, the Torah just says like Shabbos, you shouldn't do melacha because that's like Shabbos. Yom Kippur is like Shabbos. You can't do any melacha. Right? Okay. So that's just a bit of an overview halachically of the Parsha. But in terms of the storyline of the Parsha, we know that before all of this, we have the beginning of Parshas Boy is, before we get into the final plague and the final redemption, we have the last 3 plagues. Right? So we have the 7 plagues in last week's Parsha, the first 7 of the 10 plagues. In this week's Parsha, we have the last 3 plagues. Also hinted the name of the Parsha, of course. It's Parshas Boy. Boy is the gematria of 3. Beis and Aleph, so therefore that's the remaining 3 plagues, right? So I thought I would do, especially because we never share actually it was a share last week, but I didn't give a share last week. And we often miss out some of these parshas because it's summertime, whatever the case is. So I'm going to go through with you firstly a kliyokar to do with the makkos, to do with the plagues. A nice kliyokar. Gives a bit of perspective on understanding 2 ways to understand the 10 plagues, what they all were, right? So he starts like this. He says like this. We know that the plagues are divided into 3 parts. We say this on the Seder night also, right? And if you remember, when we enumerate the Seder, when we enumerate the 10 plagues in the Seder, then we say Rabbi Yehuda used to give a sign to remember the 10 plagues. Tzach, Adash, Be'achav. Remember that in the Seder? So the Tzach is the first 3. Dam, Tzvardeya, Kinim. Adash is, that's blood, frogs and lice. Next 3 is Adash, which is Oroiv, Dever, Shchin, wild animals, pestilence, the animals dying, and boils. And then Be'achav is the last 4, which is Borod, hail, Arbe, which is locust, Choshech, darkness, and the last one, Achav, Beis, Bechoros, the first one. Okay. Now, since you look in the Chumash, you'll see that the Torah actually breaks it up into these 3 sections. Because there's a certain warning which is given at the beginning of each 3 sections. So there's a certain warning that's given at the beginning of the plague of blood, then the plague of wild animals, and the plague of hail. And basically it's Hashem saying that tell Moshe Rabbeinu to tell Paroi, I'm giving the following plague in order for the Mitzrayim to know that there's no one like Hashem. That's the rough translation of each warning that happens at the beginning of each of the 3 sections. However, he points out that it's a different one, right? Because, give me 1 second. At the beginning of this week's Parsha, no, sorry, that's okay. So he says like this, right? Just 1 second. Let me just find that there. I know it's at the beginning of borrowed, sorry, so last week's Parsha, here we are. Okay, I can't find the exact term. Oh, it doesn't matter. Here we are. Okay. If you go back a few pages, go to 336. Right? 336 is the warning, Pasuk Yudal, Pasuk 14. Right? So this is the warning before the last section, before hail. Right? Hail is the last section. So Hashem says, this time, I'm going to send all my plagues to your heart, your servants, in order that you should know, there's no one like me in the whole land. Right? So it's that kind of warning. However, the Yaakov points out, if you look at the warning before each of the three sections, they're a little bit different. Right? So I'm going to read it to you. He says like this. The first one, it says, you should know that I am God. That's all it says. Avur Teida, Kani Hashem. You should know that I'm God. That's before blood. Before wild animals, which is the second section, it says, you should know that I am Hashem bekerev ha'aretz. I am Hashem in the midst of the land. Amongst the land. Different expression, right? And then the final section, it says, you should know, the one I just showed you, Ba'avur Teida, you should know that there's no one like me in the whole world, in the whole earth, right? So why the difference, right? So the Kli Yaakov develops a very interesting perspective on the 10 plagues. I want to share it with you because it's very nice. It's like this. He says that the Egyptians fought God and opposed God and challenged God on 3 levels, right? Firstly, we find that generally they challenged the existence of God. Right? Parsha said, I don't know, who said there's a God? Right? You served idols, I'm the river, I made the river, and so on and so on. Right? It says, Le'adaiti es Hashem, and so on. That's why, in the first section of the plagues, we'll see how this plays out specifically in the plagues, but let's just do it generally first. In the first section of the plagues, Hashem says, this is what I'm focusing on now. I'm sending you plagues so you should know, Ki ani Hashem, that I exist. That's it, the existence of God. The second thing that the Egyptians opposed, on the second level, was like this. He says that even if there is a God, but who said, these are 3 sort of distorted ways of thinking in terms of understanding the faith in Hashem, right? The first thing is understanding God exists, that's number 1. Number 2, there's a thinking that even if God does exist, but who says that God is mashgiach, that he supervises all the details that are happening on earth? Hashgacha pratis, right? Who says that involved? It might exist, but right? And there was such a thinking among the ages, throughout the centuries. There was a thinking among deniers of Hashem's existence, or proper people who believe in Hashem, that Hashem exists. He might have even created the world, but that's it. He left it run on its own. In other words, he doesn't get involved in terms of the details, what we call Hashgacha pratis. In other words, that Hashem is involved in every detail of what happens in the earth, right? And that was the focus of the second set of plagues. And that's why Hashem said no. In the second plagues, he warned differently. He said, not just you should know that I'm Hashem, but you should know, Ki ani Hashem, that I am God, bekerev ha'aretz. I'm amongst the earth. In other words, I'm involved in the earth. I supervise what's happening in every detail. Right? What's the third thing? The third thing is, okay, Hashem created the world. He might even be involved. But he created other forces as well. In other words, there are other autonomous sources outside of Hashem. Primarily the sources of nature, the forces that make nature work. Particularly the skies and the constellations, the sun and the moon. Because as the Rambam explains, right, the Rambam says, in the very beginning of the laws of idol worship, and the Rambam gives the background to pagan worship of how it happened in the world, the Rambam says that actually the original mistake of pagan worship was this, that they started to believe after a while, after Adam was created, they had an understanding on the constellations, the sun, the moon, the planets, and so on and so forth, They saw and realized and noticed that Hashem's sustenance comes through the planets and the sun and the moon and so on and so forth, right? So the first mistake of pagan worship was they began to believe that's true. Hashem is like the ultimate boss, but there's middle management. Hashem gave a certain autonomy to the planets of the earth, like the sun and the moon and the stars, and they have a certain decision-making process in terms of how the world works. Which in that case they decided that even though Hashem is the ultimate creator, that it's worthy and it's appropriate to give sort of cover, to give honor and to serve and to give respect to the middle managers, to the sun, the moon, and the stars, which is why they started serving the sun, the moon, and stars until at the end they came to a complete mistake that they forgot about Hashem altogether and they just served the planets. Right? That was part of. That's why before the original Avodah Zarah, which was the concept that we call today pagan worship of idols and stuff, the original Avodah Zarah, the original pagan worship was really serving the stars. In fact, in the Gemara, when we talk about someone who's an Ovid Avodah Zarah, he serves idols. One of the terminologies that's used is akum. Akum means oved kochavim umazoles, someone who serves the stars and the constellations, right? So that was the third challenge. The third challenge is maybe Hashem exists, maybe Hashem is even involved, but there's also other things involved. Hashem doesn't have sole autonomy. Hashem is not the sole authority. There are certain parts which He gave up, and therefore there are certain parts of nature, for example, that He can't interfere with, because He lets it run and it's a separate thing. That's the third challenge. So on that, Hashem's warning was, right, that we see in the beginning of the Borah, the beginning of this third section, that I'm giving you now a third section of plagues, ba'avur teida, in order that you should know, ki ein kamoini b'chol haaretz. There's no one like me in the entire earth. In other words, there's nothing else besides Hashem. There's no other power besides Hashem. Right? So those are the three things, just to summarize, before we get into the specifics. The first set of plagues was just to emphasize that Hashem exists. So therefore it says, you should know that ki ani Hashem. Right? The second one was not only I exist, but I'm involved. So therefore it says, you should know, I am God amongst the earth. The third one was, not only I'm amongst the earth, I'm involved, but there's no other autonomy. There's no other autonomous power. And therefore, nature is in completely in my hands, with whatever I want and whenever I want. And that's why it says, you should know, there's no one like me in the whole earth. Right? Okay. So how does these three different emphases, how does it actually play out in the plagues? It says very beautifully. It's like this. He says, what was the first three plagues? Dam, tzvardeya, kenim. It was the existence of Hashem, basically. Fighting pure pagan worship, right? So how does it show up in the first three plagues? So first of all, the first two plagues was fighting the river. Right? The first plague was to smite the river. The river Nile was the god of the Egyptians. In other words, that is an untrue God. I'm here. There's a God. There's a God in the world over the river. Right? The second was not only I'm over the river, but I can make the river do what I want. Because what was the second plague? The second plague was the frogs. The frogs came from the river, right? And the frogs were completely subservient to the will of Hashem, so much so that he quotes a Gemara, a famous Gemara, that actually the frogs were rewarded. Because the frogs, it says in the second plague, that the frogs made a Kiddush Hashem. How did they make Kiddush Hashem? Because some of the Hashem commanded the frogs to go everywhere, including into the beds and everything, including the ovens. And the frogs listened to Hashem and they went into the ovens even though it was dangerous. And Hashem performed a miracle, those frogs didn't die. And even at the end of the plague, when all the frogs died, those frogs didn't die. They were able to go off and do anything. Why? Because later on in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, in the Babylonian king, when you had the famous three people, the famous three tzaddikim, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that were challenged by Nebuchadnezzar to convert and to serve idols, otherwise they had to be thrown into the furnace. They chose to be thrown into the furnace. Why? Because they thought to themselves, if the frogs can listen to Hashem and jump into the fire, how much more so we can, right? So the frogs made a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Frogs coming from where? From the river. In other words, the frogs was a stronger pronouncement, a stronger emphasis, the existence of Hashem. The river is not the god of the god of Egypt, but it's a false god. Hashem exists. He can smite the river and bring the frogs out of the river to do His will. Right? And then he says that the third one, of course, was the was the kinim, because by kinim, lice was an interesting thing that they had to admit that Hashem exists. Why? Because the first two plagues, it was an interesting thing with the lice. The first two plagues, we know that the magicians of Egypt copycatted, right? So they also turned water to blood. They also brought frogs. When it came to the lice was turning the particles of the ground, of the dust, into lice. But the particles are so small that witchcraft doesn't work. Witchcraft can only work apparently with things that have a certain size. So therefore they were unable to copycat that. So when it came to Kinim, they said, Etzpa Lakimi, this is the work of God. So they had to admit there's a God. Okay. That's the first part. The first emphasis just is that the God exists. The second emphasis, the second set of plagues, Adash, Orayv, Dever, Shchin, the wild animals, the pestilence, and the boils, was there to emphasize a different point, the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. Not only Hashem exists, but He's involved. How so? So what do we see? We see suddenly a very big emphasis in the Torah, even though we have a sort of a tradition that the plagues only happened to the Egyptians, didn't happen to the Jews, right? It doesn't actually become specifically emphasized in the Torah, explicitly emphasized, until the fourth Makkah. To the point, by the way, that there is an opinion that the first three Makkahs did affect the Jews. I'm not sure if the Kliyaka goes like I don't know, but there is such a thing. Because we don't find in the Torah such a distinction. Where do we find it? The first time we find it is in wild animals, right? When the wild animals, it says, V'hifleisi, Hashem said specifically, V'hifleisi b'yoymahu es eretz goyshin asher ami oymed alel levilti hayosham oreb. I will specifically make a difference between the Jewish quarters and the Egyptian quarters. The wild animals will go where the Egyptians are, they will not go, and it was very apparent, it was very open, they will not go where the Jews live. What's the emphasis of it? You say that if I exist but I don't get involved, this one yes, this one not, I don't reward the tzaddik and punish the Rasha and so on and so forth. Here you have it. Hashem said, I'm sending a plague. Not only am I sending a plague, but I'm going to show you how involved I am, that the plagues, that the animals are going to go here and they're not going to go here. Which is an emphasis of Hashgacha Pratis. Hashem says, I'm sending it, I'm very involved. I'm involved in the specifics, where the animals are going or where they're not going. Same thing we find in Dever, where the animals died. The animals died, the same thing. Hashem is going to make a difference. The animals of the Jewish people will not die. The animals of the Egyptians will die. Again, emphasizing the concept of Hashgacha Pratis, right? And the same thing with Shchin, the same thing with boils. That boils also showed the Hashgacha Pratis of Hashem, because the way boils happened was that Moshe Rabbeinu took a clump of dust and he threw it in the whole Egypt, and it sort of went all over the Egypt and smote everyone with boils. Even though it did that, it didn't smite the Jewish people with boils. So again, the concept of Hashgacha Pratis, I'm sending the particles exactly where I want them to go, and not where I don't want them to go. So that's the second set of plagues where we emphasize the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. Then comes the last ones. What's the last ones? Last ones is the greatest emphasis to explain not only does Hashem exist, not only is He involved, but there's nothing else. There's no other rishos, no other control besides Hashem, right? Which, by the way, is one of the translations of the word Hashem Echad that we say every day, right? But Hashem Echad is not just the belief in existence of Hashem. I mean, Hashem Echad has many layers to understand what it means, but one of the things it means also, Hashem Echad, Hashem is the only source of sustenance. Nothing else has a control. Even when Hashem chooses, by the way, to send certain things through Teva, through nature, or send things through the Kachavim and Mazolis, through the stars, through the planets, and so on and so forth, the expression that Chazal use is that all we have to understand that all these things is kegarzen b'yad ha'choitzev. It's like an axe in the hand of a woodchopper. No autonomy. It's all got to do with, we say this in Yom Kippur as well, as a whole song we sing about it, right? Where in other words, it's just Hashem using the axe, but it's completely up to Him how it operates. Nothing has even secondary control, right? That's the ultimate amunah in Hashem. Not only Hashem exists, not only is evolved, but that there's nothing else. Even if we do work, and even if we invest, and even if we make business, whatever we do, nothing, actually the bracha only comes from Hashem. It goes through things, which Hashem chooses it to go through, but ultimately the anything that happens in the world is only from Hashem, right? And with no partnership with anything. So how's that emphasized in the last set of makkahs, where Hashem said, "Leman Teida, you should know, ki ein komoini, there's none like me in the whole of the earth." He says very simple. The last three, the seventh, the eighth, and the ninth, which is the second set, right? All are things which camouflage and block the planets of the earth, right? So when it fell hail was a very big storm. At that it became dark. The Torah says with arbe, with locusts, it was the same thing. There was such an unbelievable plague with locusts that the chisos ein haaretz actually darkened the earth, right? And the same thing with darkness. Darkness means for 6 days they couldn't see a thing. There was no suns, there was no planets, including the ultimate and final one, which is the concept of makas b'choros. Makas b'choros was also done. It was the ultimate blow from Hashem, the ultimate miracle. When did it happen? At night, when the sun doesn't shine. Right? The whole idea was that you think you're serving the planets and the constellations, you think there's some autonomy to them, you think there's power, there's no power to them. I bring plagues and I block them out completely to show that actually they're not really in the picture, and the only authority and the only source of any flow of sustenance or blessing in this world only comes from Hashem. So that's the Kli Yakar's take on the Makkos. It's interesting because when we sit down to this, when Pesach comes and we sit down, we always have this distinction. It's not just a Rosh Hashanah, it's not just an acronym, the Tzach Hadash B'Achav, but it's actually, the plagues are actually set into these 3 sections, and each section brought out and emphasized something different. Interesting. Sorry?
Right.
Yeah. Now, while we're on that topic, I'll just show you just on another level a little bit, because the same Kli Yakar goes through all the 10 plagues, and just explains why each plague happened. Now, there's so many different Mefarshim that explain why each plague happened, but I just thought, while I'm already on this Kli Yakar, I'll show you. It says like this. He says again, the first one, as we know, was the plague of blood. This is like a different explanation, but just explain each plague, what it came for. In other words, why did it come for, and what did it punish? Right? He says, of course, the first one was smiting the river. The river turned to blood. That was because Paro referred to the river as his god. And also, we know that they threw the children into the river, and therefore that the river god was the first one to get the punishment. And also, the fish died in the river. Fish died because fish are a symbol of multiplication. The Yidgul Arayv. It says that the Yidden will multiply, like fish multiply a lot, so people will also multiply. And they wanted to stop the multiplying of the Jewish people, and therefore the first one to get it was the river, right? Second one was the frogs. Same sort of thing what he said before. It's because Parsha said that he doesn't believe in the existence of Hashem. So we have the frogs who came out and listened to Hashem and jumped into the fire and so on and so forth. Right? The kinim, the lice, it says, was because the lice was really a punishment for the earth. It changed the earth, the dust of the earth into lice. And that was because the Egyptians made the Jewish people work the earth. Right? Orayv. Wild animals, it says interesting, why did they get wild animals? Because it was a punishment for the Egyptians enslaving the Jewish people who are compared to animals. Now, where do we find this? We find this in the beginning of Shmos. You know, when Paro called Shifra and Puah, right, and told them they were midwives, and he told them that when you assist the Jewish women to have children, if it's a son, you should kill him. They didn't listen. They came back to Paro called them back and said, why didn't you listen? So they said, we can't, because you have to understand that the women that we are assisting, ki choyos heino, they are like animals. Now, Rashi explains, what do they mean? They meant something double. They meant, like, first of all, like animals, we see that they compared to animals, because if you go back a Parsha before Shmos, in Parshas Vayechi, when Yaakov gives the brocha to the Jewish people, to the 12 tribes, he compares each tribe to another animal, right? So Yosef was an ox, and this one's a snake, and this one, right? What do they mean when they said Kichoyesei? They say they're being compared to animals, they've been blessed to be like animals. What's the blessing of being like an animal? An animal doesn't mean a midwife. An animal gives birth on its own. Before we get there, the kid's born already, right? We get called, as a backup, but the truth is that they don't need us. By the time we get there, it's already over, and the child's already born, it's in his mother's hands, etc., etc. So the Jewish people we see are compared, they have this positive comparison to animals, and because the Mitzrayim, because the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people who are like animals, therefore they were punished to get wild animals come upon them. Where the wild animals came upon them and didn't affect the Jewish people. Why? Because we have a principle, says the Kli Yakar, very beautifully says, Ki ein chayo mazekes l'chaverto. Animals don't harm other animals. So therefore the animals came to the Jewish people and they compared to animals, therefore they left them alone. Okay. All right. Then he says, Dever, pestilence. Pestilence was that their sheep and their flock died. Why was that? That was a punishment for in other words, the enslaving of Jewish people had many aspects to it, right? Each aspect was a sort of needed its own punishment. So one of them was that it's interesting that when the Shvatim came to Egypt, right, when the sons of Yaakov originally came to Egypt, what was their occupation? They were shepherds. In other words, they weren't farmers. They weren't builders. They were shepherds. When the Egyptians enslaved them, they removed them from their occupation. They removed them from dealing with flock and made them into builders. That was a punishment. Therefore, their own flock died. Yeah. Shchini says, what was the idea of boils? Boils was because what they did was, with their enslaving, they also minimized the relationship and the intimacy between husband and wife, and therefore they were smitten with boils, which made their own intimacy a lot more difficult. Borod, hail. So we know from the pasuk in hail, he says that the pasuk says that when the hail fell, it made a tremendous noise, a coil, a voice, right? What was that for a punishment? That they didn't want to listen to the voice of Hashem, and therefore Hashem sent hail. A hail which had both fire and water in it together. We know, we say every Friday night before Lachadoidi, we read that parak of Tehillim, we talk about the voice of Hashem, and it says the voice of Hashem, Koil Hashem, Chaytsev Laha voice Eish, the voice of Hashem is like flames of fire. And we said Koil Hashem Alamoyim, the voice of Hashem is like water. So therefore this was the voice of Hashem, so to speak, expressing itself in the hail and the fire to punish the Egyptians who refused to listen to the voice of Hashem. Then he says, what's the locus? Arbe. Arbe is because the word locus is arbe, but arbe also comes from the word to multiply. And again, they wanted to prevent the Jewish people from multiplying, so therefore they got smitten with locusts. Choshech, darkness. He says darkness because they forced the Jewish people to hide their children when they made the decree, like Moshe Rabbeinu, right? They forced them to have to hide their children in darkness, so they shouldn't get caught by the Egyptians and be thrown into the river, and therefore they will get smitten by darkness. And Makas B'chayris, of course, is because a general concept. The whole thing was that Hashem referred to the Jewish people as B'ni B'chayri Yisrael, by firstborn the Jewish people, by firstborn son Hashem refers to the Jewish people, and the Egyptian enslaved the Jewish people are called Hashem's B'chayr, Hashem's firstborn, so therefore they got smitten with the concept of the firstborn dying. Okay. Good. So that's just a little bit on the plagues. As I said, this is the last. Boils was because it says that they prevented the Jews from being intimate with each other. In other words, relationships. They weakened the marriages, right? Because people were enslaved, and so therefore they were smitten with plagues, which made it difficult for them. Yeah. All right, just a little bit. I mean, there are many Mefarshim to go through the 10 plagues, but just this is a nice way of one of the ways of doing it. All right. Now, I want to share with you something from the Parsha, which also connected to something else, and I'll show you. I'll show you why I'm bringing this up now, because of a special thing, and I'll explain to you. So one of the things we know, I'll just show you where it is, 1 second. If you go to page, go to page 358. Towards the bottom, Pasuk Mem Aleph, Pasuk 41. The Pasuk says the following. Vayihi, page 358. Vayihi miketz shloshim shana. It was the end of 30 years. V'arba ma'is shana, and 400 years. By the way, different numbers. This is a side point. Different numbers given around when it comes to going out of Egypt, right? We know one number. They were in Egypt for 210 years. Sometimes we find the number 400 years, that's from the birth of Yitzchak. But over here it says the end of 430 years. What that means is 430 years is from the Bris Ben Absorim, the covenant that Hashem made with Avraham Avinu, the original time where Hashem revealed to Avraham Avinu that his children would in fact be slaves in a foreign land, right? That was the dream, the vision that Avraham Avinu had. So at the end of 430 years, Vayhi be'etzem hayoim hazeh, was in the middle of this day, Yotzu kol tzivois Hashem. All the, how do you translate tzivos Hashem? The English says the legions of Hashem. Other places it translates the community of Hashem, the hosts of Hashem, right? Yotzu kol tzivos Hashem, me'eretz Mitzrayim, they all went out of Eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, so that's the interesting way that the Yidden refer to over here, tzivois Hashem. It's the first time we find in Chumash that the Yidden are called tzivois Hashem. If you look in a little bit later, if you look in 360, next page, at the end of the chapter, Pasuk Nun Aleph, chapter Pasuk verse 51, it says again, Vayhi be'etzem hayoyim hazeh, was in the middle of the day, Hoitzi Hashem es b'nei Yisrael, me'eretz Mitzrayim, Hashem took out the Jewish people from the land of Egypt, al tziv'oisam, similar lashon, in their legions, in their community, all as one, whatever, etc., etc. Okay. So, what does this actually mean? Why? It's the first time we encounter this really, that tzivois, tzivoisam, what does it actually mean? Right? So I'm going to share with you a whole idea, and it comes from a particular thing. I'll just share with you why I'm sharing with you now, because so next week is Yud Shvat, there's the 10th of Shvat, which is in the Chabad calendar a very important day. It's the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe. And this year it's 70 years. That's a very big year, which also marks 70 years of the Rebbe's leadership. So when the Rebbe, his son-in-law, took over, that was a very big turning point in Chabad history, or world history, you could say. So that was 70 years ago, right? In 1950. So it's a significant event. It's a significant milestone. Now, in particular, so for the Rebbe, the 10th of Shvat was always a very important day. He would always speak a lot. It was his father-in-law's yahrzeit. But there was something else that was interesting. So when the previous Rebbe passed away, so there were a lot of signs in the year before he passed away alluding to the fact that he was going to pass away, just as an interesting thing. He, for example, and I've seen this in copies of letters and stuff, he started to sign his name differently for a year before. He used to sign his name Yosef Yitzchak, and for a year before he started signing also Yosef. Very fascinating. I mean, you could see it's and no one knew why for a whole year. It got bigger and bigger actually as the year progressed, and then he passed away on Yud Shvat, which was interesting, the 10th of Shvat. Anyway, there are a few different things. Now, one of the things he did was just before he passed away, he asked the Rebbe, his son-in-law, to prepare an old discourse that he had said, an old mimer that he had said, because the last few years of the previous Rebbe's life was hard for him to speak. He actually didn't talk so much in public, but they used to reprint like old memorim and edit them and so on and so forth. So there was a famous discourse that was printed on Friday. The Yud Shvat was Shabbos that year, and it was printed on Friday, just before he passed away, and it was 20 chapters, and it was a mimer that started with the famous words, Basi Legani Achoisi Kala, where Hashem says, it's a Pasuk in Shir Hashirim, referring to the time of the giving of the Torah, where Hashem says, I've come to my garden, I've come to my, sort of back to where I wanted to be, Hashem's presence in the world, and so on. And it's a mimer, it's a discourse of 20 chapters, which was made into 4 sections for different occasions, and so on. So, and it came out for that Shabbos. Why did he ask the mimer to be printed for that Shabbos? Because even before the previous Rebbe passed away, Yud Shvat was also a special day because it was his grandmother's yahrzeit. Rebbe Tzarivka's yahrzeit, and therefore it was a significant day. So he asked the mimer to be printed in 4 sections in honor of Yud Shvat, which is his grandmother's yahrzeit. The second section was in honor of his mother's yahrzeit. Then Purim, and the second of Nisan, which was going to be his father's yahrzeit. That's like a one discourse, but in 4 sections. Okay. So the Rebbe, when he passed away the next day, the Rebbe took it as like sort of that this mimer was like the previous Rebbe's sort of last, will and testament, you can say in a way, right? And every Yud Shvat, the Rebbe would say a mimer, would say a discourse based on that discourse. And every year he would explain a different chapter. Right? So he went through almost all, like it was for over 4 years, he went through almost all the chapters twice. So every year, Chassidim also study with particular emphasis that particular chapter. So this year being 70 years, which means it's now in the 4th cycle, so it's chapter 10, right, of that discourse. Why am I not giving this whole background? And we have a few printed discourses of the Rebbe explaining the chapter 10 very, very well in terms of understanding. So what's the chapter 10 about? The chapter 10 is about the fact that the Jewish people, it's interesting because it comes around this time of the year, chapter 10 begins to explain this concept that the Jews are called Tzivos Hashem. That this in this week's Parsha, Tzivos Hashem, so I thought, especially on the next week, I'll share with you the little bit of the explanation. It's a very long and involved explanation, different aspects to it, but I'll show you a couple of different things. So first of all, because a little bit highlights the whole mission of the Jewish people, right? So it's interesting that the Jewish people here are called Tzivos Hashem, similar to the word Tzva'os, right? Which we know in the Gemara, it says that Hashem, one of the names of Hashem is Tzva'os, right? You know, we say in davening, Kadosh, like in Kedusha, we say Hashem Tzva'os, Malach Kvayda, right? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? Hashem Tzva'ot, maybe? Tzva'ot? Is that that's more familiar? In Kedusha on Shabbos, like we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kasher, Hashem Tzva'ot, Malach Kvayda, right? So it's one of the names of Hashem. There's a dispute in the Gemara if it's one of the holy names. The halacha is it is. In fact, it's considered one of the names you're not supposed to erase, right? And yet, it's an interesting thing. Although it's one of the 7 names of Hashem, right? It's not mentioned in the Chumash, right? The Gemara says that really the first one to refer to Hashem as Tzva'ot was Chana, the mother of Shmuel Hanavi. Yeah? So that in itself needs to be understood. Why is that? So the explanation for that, which will lead into the explanation of why in the Parsha the Yidden are called Tzivos Hashem, is because the different. What is the name of Hashem? What does it mean, the name of Hashem? Right? So we know the famous medrash that Moshe Rabbeinu was at the burning bush and he said to Hashem, "I'm going to come back to Egypt and they're going to ask me what your name is. What should I tell them?" So Hashem said essentially, "I don't have a name. Depends what I'm doing, right? Depends what I'm doing at the time." What does it mean I don't have a name? So what's the essence of that meaning? What's the essence of that medrash? The essence of the medrash means that Hashem doesn't have a name because a name is a description at the end of the day. A name is somewhat limiting, even by a person, by the way, right? A person sort of in his own essence can be without a name, although the name, a person does have a name, because the name represents what the essence. The Gemara says that Rabbi Meir had a medayik b'shvor. Rabbi Meir was able to take a person's name and work out the character of the person from the name, right? So a name kind of is a description, a manifestation of the person. Hashem in his essence doesn't have a name because Hashem actually is above all definition, above all description, above any sort of terminology that can describe him. There's nothing that can describe Hashem, right? Different to other people, so on and so forth. But Hashem is above names. That's why the Aseret Adibros, 10 Commandments, also starts off with that name. It says, Anochi, I am who I am. And then it says Hashem Elokecha and so on, right? However, Hashem chose, because he can, because he's truly infinite, therefore, even though he's above description, but he can choose to manifest himself in certain times, in certain ways. Right? So Hashem chooses to manifest himself in a particular way. So therefore it says in the Medrash, it depends. If I'm fighting a war, then I'm called Elakim. If I'm giving kindness, I'm called Kael. Whatever the case, it depends what I'm doing, right? Okay. So therefore, when Hashem is called with a name, we still call him holy names because it's manifestation of Hashem. Right? It's manifestation of Hashem's presence. But yes, it doesn't describe his essence because he's really above names, but when he chooses to manifest himself in a particular way, it's him. He is still part of what he's manifesting himself in. Right? Does that make sense? So it says even when Hashem lowers himself, so to speak, to manifest himself in kindness or in intellect or in judgment, whatever the case is, you can't separate between him and his kindness. It's still him. It's just he's chosen to manifest himself in a particular way, but it's still completely him. Okay. Yeah? Clear so far? Okay. The one name that is a little bit different, which is not mentioned in the Torah, is Tzva'ot. Why? It says the first one was Chana, and really was a name used much later by the Nevi'im, by the prophets. Why? Because in the manifestation of Hashem, there's also 2 levels. Okay, it's a bit of a deep idea, this. It's almost like this. A little bit understand even by a person, like sometimes a person, right? Sometimes, I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a very, very wise person, extremely wise person, right? A brilliant person, right? And they used to, that doesn't necessarily affect the rest of the world. Hashem, it's a revelation of Hashem. It's still Hashem, as Hashem chooses to manifest himself in a particular way, but it's his infinite manifestation. It's like a description. Hashem chose to describe himself or to put himself or to express himself in wisdom or in kindness or in judgment, but it's still completely him. It's like the brilliant man just talking brilliance. Understand? But then there's Hashem who continues the creation process, because that's what it says in Kabbalah. It says in Kabbalah, before Hashem created the world, Hashem first created what we call the world of Atzilus, which is just Hashem chose to manifest himself in different descriptions. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, and that's what the names of Hashem have to do with these different spheres. Hashem's revelation. But that wasn't the intention. The intention ultimately was that Hashem actually wanted to reveal himself in a world which, so to speak, exists kind of outside of him. Right? But that's not mentioned in the Chumash somewhere. That's more what the job of the Jewish people is to bring Hashem into the world. And that's the name of Tzvaot. That's why it's different to all the other names. The name of Tzvaot is, in fact, what does the word Tzvaot actually stand for? So it's brought down, it stands for Ot B'Tzava. It's a sign of Hashem in his army, in his legions. Normally when we talk about the legions of Hashem, we talk about the angels, right? And the angels already is a creation. The angel's not Hashem himself, but it's Hashem revealing himself to the angels. That's what we talk about davening. We talk about how the angels recognize Hashem's presence, and it says Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvaot Melech Halas Kadosh, right? Hashem's the God of the hosts, the God of the angels. So the name of Tzvaot, the name of Hashem of Tzvaot, is different to Hashem and Elokim and all the other names. Hashem's revelation himself. Tzvaot means that you take the revelation of Hashem and you connect it with the world. That you reveal Hashem not just himself, but you reveal Hashem in the created world. In the world which appears to be separate from Hashem, which appears to be finite, which appears to be a Bria, creation, outside of Hashem, so to speak, you reveal Hashem's presence and show that even the world is really connected with God, right? And that's why it's a name which isn't in the Chumash, because the Chumash is more about Hashem's revelation of his own presence. The Nevi'im, the prophets, and those that came afterwards, their job was then to bring Hashem into the world, and that's why Chana developed the name Tzvaot. Why am I bringing all of this? What do we see with the word Tzvaot? The word Tzvaot means it's the name of Hashem, but its purpose is it's the name of Hashem revealing Hashem into something else, revealing Hashem into a different existence, revealing Hashem into the world. This is why when the Jews left Egypt, they were called Tzivos Hashem. It doesn't mean just the army of Hashem, it means it signifies what their purpose is. And let me explain this to you. The word Sava explains over there in that discourse actually has 3 translations. Right? The 3 translations is, one is army, the concept of fighting, the struggle, right? Sava, fighting a battle. The second translation of Tzva is, it's based on a pasuk in Eov that says, Haloi tzva le'enosh ale oretz. Tzva means a designated time, a set time, that a person has a set time on this earth. So tzava means a time, a set time. And the third translation of the word tzava is the word tzivyon, which means beauty. That every creation was created with a certain form, with a certain beauty. Right? So what has that got to do with the Jewish people's mission? So what is the mission of Am Yisrael? Right? Why do we exist? Why were we created? Why did Hashem take us out of Mitzrayim? Why did He give us the Torah? He gave us the Torah to bring Hashem into the world. That's what He gave us the Torah for. Right? Which is why we call Tzivos Hashem. That's the idea, bringing Hashem into something else. Our purpose is to create a dwelling place for Hashem in this world. To bring Hashem into the world. To take the world which is a place of darkness, a world which is a place which seems detached from Hashem, and to bring Hashem into the world. How do we do that? So Hashem said, I'm calling you Tzivos, because you do it with inclusivity. True beauty means when you blend with other things. Right? Tiferet, the idea of Tiferet is when you have a different colors, different things together. Because it's understanding that the true beauty of the mission of Am Yisrael is to understand that each person has their role. Each person has a designated purpose. We all have to keep all the mitzvahs, we all have to follow Hashem, but we each have a different purpose, different mission, that's fine. And that's how we all have to stick to our mission, and have to understand that we have to join with other people's mission as well. And it's all the missions together that make up the ultimate purpose of creation, which is to bring Hashem into the whole world, which was created in a way of beauty, created with different creations, different things. And our job is then to bring Hashem into every part of the world by each person doing a different part of the puzzle, right? So that's why the Yidden are called Tzivos Hashem. Even though Tzivos is a name that comes later in Tanakh, but it's the same idea. The idea is that the name Tzivos of Hashem, which comes later in Tanakh, is the idea of bringing Hashem, not just revealing Hashem himself, but bringing Hashem's presence into something else, into a world which seems to hide Hashem's presence. So too, that's the essence of the Jewish mission, which is to bring Hashem into the world and make the world the dwelling place for Hashem through these three worlds, through winning a struggle, to make always understand that it's a struggle we have to fight and transform it and go against the tide, elevating each day, and understanding each person's mission, all working together to create the true beauty of bringing Hashem into the world. Okay.
Is the word Tzivos related to Tziva? When we say Torah Tziva?
No, because it's with the Aleph. Tziva means Tziv Hashem, so it's like an Aleph, yeah. It's different.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem.
In which time frame was it that the Jewish women gave birth to many children at one time?
Right through the slave